In the west, where Egypt and the Assyrian Empire were separated only by the Sinai Desert, the rulers of the Nile had long incited revolt amongst Assyria's Palestinian and Syrian dependencies. Determined to put an end to such provocations, Esarhaddon, in the year 671, marched 15 days across the Sinai, which was, he said, infested by two-headed snakes, and captured the Egyptian capital of Memphis. No sooner had he withdrawn, however, than the Egyptians rebelled. He set out to recapture Memphis in 669, but died on the way. The empire was divided between two sons, Shamash-Shumi-Ukin, who reigned over Babylonia, and Ashurbanipal, who ruled all the rest. For a time, the arrangement worked. Ashurbanipal reconquered Memphis and extended Assyria's Egyptian domain as far south as Thebes. But jealousy festered within Shamash-Shumi-Ukin, and in 652 his troops attacked a garrison near Babylon, commanded by Ashurbanipal. Soon civil war raged across the land. It ended only after a 3-year siege of Babylon. In the final days, the dead were piled high in the city streets, and chroniclers recounted that survivors ate the flesh of their sons and daughters for their starvation. At the last, Shamash-Shumi-Ukin flung himself into the flames of his blazing palace. After giving his brother a burial befitting his royal blood, Ashurbanipal extracted an appalling revenge against the other rebels. I fed their corpses, cut into small pieces, to the dogs, pigs, vultures, eagles, birds of the sky, and to the fish of the ocean, he boasted. Curiously, Ashurbanipal would be remembered not as the brute of Babylon, but as a scholarly ruler who boasted of his own literacy, who created a great library at Nineveh, and, by bringing calm to the Middle East, and earned the contemporary saying, "Throughout all lands a peace prevailed, like the finest oil were the world's 4 quarters." When the studious old warrior's 43-year reign ended on his death in 626 BC, the Assyrian Empire seemed at the summit of its power and prestige. In fact, it was on the brink of extinction. The end came so swiftly and so complete that few details were known. Clearly, Assyria had spread itself thin by its maintenance of a vast empire, yet just as clearly its long-time policies had at last brought their calamitous reward. Assyria's atrocious behavior had made it the object of seething hatreds. Its huge army was shot through and through with discontented units, incorporated from defeated foes, and thanks to its infamous deportation programs, its great cities may have housed more inhabitants of foreign extraction than native Assyrians. Scarcely had Ashurbanipal been placed in his tomb than the Babylonian throne was seized by Nabopolassar. He was a sheik of the Chaldean tribes, Semitic people who had settled in the swamps and marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. Within a few years, the Chaldeans formed an aggressive alliance with the Indo-European Medes, who had migrated to western Iran, and with the fierce Scythians, who had swept southward from their homeland in Central Asia. In 612 BC, the allies marched against Assyria, whose king, Sin-Shar-Ishkun, embroiled in factional fighting at home, unsuccessfully battled them at Kablini and Arabha, then took refuge behind the walls of Nineveh. The heavily fortified Assyrian capital fell within 3 months, and although the tattered remnants of the Assyrian army fought a running battle for another few years, they were finally eradicated in an engagement at Karchemish. The Assyrian Empire was no more, and the rest of the Middle East celebrated its downfall. Declared the biblical prophet Nahum, "All who hear the news of you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not yet come your unceasing evil." The victors of Karchemish had surprisingly little dispute about dividing the spoils. The Medes assumed power in eastern Assyria, in the former Assyrian provinces north and east of the Tigris. Almost unnoticed, but soon to be of momentous consequence, was the relegation of the Persians, a group of Indo-European tribes who had settled in ancient Elam, to vassalage under the Medes. As for the Babylonians, Nabopolassar died within a year of his triumph, and was succeeded by his son Nebuchadnezzar II, an experienced soldier who swiftly moved to take over the western reaches of the Assyrian Empire. He subdued Syria and extended his realm to the border of Egypt, which had by then regained its independence. The little kingdom of Judah remained a trouble spot. There, despite calamitous warnings from the prophet Jeremiah, King Jehoiakim ignored his promise to pay tribute to Babylonia. No man to trifle with, Nebuchadnezzar laid successful siege to Jerusalem, and although sparing the city, took more than 10,000 leading Jewish citizens back to Babylon as hostages for future good behavior. Yet only a decade later, Judah's king Zedekiah, who had been installed as a Babylonian vassal, conspired with Egypt and Phoenicia to oust the Chaldean overlord. Nebuchadnezzar marched again. This time he meant to obliterate the annoyance. Jerusalem was utterly destroyed, and its remaining inhabitants, except for the very poorest, were taken to Babylon. At home, Nebuchadnezzar was an enlightened monarch who dedicated himself to restoring Babylon to its ancient grandeur. Among many other projects, he erected a magnificent temple for Marduk, and, because his Median wife still yearned for her native mountains, built a new palace high on the hill that was terraced and profusely planted, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which would come to be counted as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But in the Middle East, all empires were temporal, and so it was with Chaldean Babylonia. The empire would not long survive Nebuchadnezzar, who died in 562 BCE. In Persia, a young prince had cast off the yoke of the Medes and would soon embark on a military campaign that would overwhelm Babylonia. He would become known as Cyrus the Great and would create an empire surpassing any the world had ever seen.